Hey everyone, this is Pallavi and I'm back with the second game of the book called Chess: The Art of Logical Thinking by Neil MacDonald. This game was played between Huebner and Portisch in Brussels in 1986. The opening played in this game was Rui Lopez. Let's start. White started with e4, an excellent move as it occupies the center and both the queen and bishop gain better visibility. Choosing e3 achieves a similar effect but limits the space for white's forces. More space means more activity, increasing chances to attack and checkmate. Black played e5. Black too controls the center and makes way for the bishop and queen. Knight f3 developing towards the center with a threat on the e5 pawn. Knight c6. Black develops towards the center and supports the e5 pawn. Bishop b5. White completes his kingside development and at the same time harasses the knight, which is the protector of the e5 pawn. a6. Sometimes the best answer to a threat is to ignore it. Black encourages white to take on c6, knowing that after bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight takes e4, queen d4, he regains his pawn and gains a highly comfortable position with knight f3 and then queen takes e4 check. So after a6, now white played bishop to a4. Although the immediate bishop takes c6 doesn't work, sooner or later it is going to become a real threat and then black is going to have to waste time or weaken his position slightly to prevent it. Knight f6, developing towards the center, attacking the e4 pawn and mobilizing his kingside position. Castle. White remains focused on rapid development despite the threat to the e4 pawn. If now knight takes e4, then d4 will ensure white regains his pawn whilst keeping a space advantage. We have seen an example of this in the game Karpov versus Kochnai in the previous video. If bishop c5 instead, then c3, b5, bishop b3, d6 and then d4, attacking the bishop and controlling the center. So after castle, black played bishop to e7. Now this is a sensible developing move which ensures black will be able to castle kingside. Rook e1. White defends his e4 pawn while bringing out the rook. Now white is threatening to capture bishop takes c6 followed by knight takes e5. So after rook e1, black played b5. Here the value of the third move a6 becomes clear. Black prevents the white's bishop attack on c6, safeguards the e5 pawn and gains space on the queen side. Now white played bishop to b3. The bishop's retreat is not all bad news for white. In fact, it provokes b5 leading back black to weaken their queenside pawns. This allows white to undermine them with the later a2 to a4. Now black played d6. Black fortifies his hold on the e5 point and opens the diagonal for the c8 bishop. c3. White deviates from classical development with knight c3, meeting the specific position's demands. This move, c3, prepares him to play d4 and to respond e5 takes d4 to c takes d4, keeping two pawns in the center. It also creates an escape route on c2 for his bishop to counter any potential knight a5 from knight a5 move from black to secure two bishops. This bending rather than breaking of classical rules involves forming a center with pawns on e4 and d4 while preventing black from disrupting it with e takes d4 Moreover, it aligns with the classical preference for two bishops over two knights, as white hinders black from obtaining the two bishops through knight a5 and then knight takes b3. So white played castle, black played castle. Following the principles, get your pieces out and your king castled as soon as possible. h3, good move. World champion Emanuel Lasker criticized every pawn move with a clear purpose. So why does white opt for a small pawn move on the h file while they could have played d4 immediately, securing the space in the center? In harmonious opening play, preventing your opponent from making good moves is as important as playing good moves yourself. In this position, d4 would allow black to respond with bishop to g4, exploiting the well-placed black bishop to pin the knight that supports the white's hinder. Hence, white chooses to take a moment and to avoid getting pinned. So white plays h3 and controls the g4 square. Even when making a move on the edge of the board, white's focus remains on the center. b7. Black's bishop, frustrated on one diagonal, finds another reasonable position to potentially attack the e4 point. Remarkably, all of Black's minor pieces have found influential squares in the center with just 9 moves. d4. At last, all White's preparations are complete and he seizes a slight but enduring space advantage. Rook e8. Black both centralizes the rook and clears the f8 square for his bishop in order to improve the strategic disposition of his pieces. Knight b d2. Blocked on c3, the knight relocates to d2, the only other central square. From d2 it can maneuver to g3 via f1, contributing to the defense of e4 and influencing the center without impeding other pieces. Alternatively, redeploying the knight to e3 to control d5 and f5 poses a risk, possibly obstructing the bishop on c1 and the rook on e1, making the e4 pawn vulnerable. Keeping all pieces satisfied is indeed a challenge. So after knight b d2, black played bishop f8, a useful retreat for the bishop as it now can be activated with g6 followed by bishop g7 if needed. This hinders white's knight maneuver knight f1 since would be vulnerable to e takes d4, uncovering a double attack on the e4 pawn. So that's why after bishop f8, white did not play knight f1, white played a4. Why the sudden rook's pawn move? Huebner's previous moves were aimed at controlling the center and gaining an advantage as the first mover. Now he forms a specific plan, capitalizing on the gap in black's pawn structure caused by b5. White aims to exploit this weakness or use it to open lines for his queen side. For his pieces on the queen side, the current move aligns perfectly with these strategies. So black played queen d7. Instead, if b takes a4, then bishop takes a4 would benefit white, leaving black with a weak pawn on a6 and facing the threat of d5, pinning the knight on c6. Alternatively, b4. If b4 causes less damage to black's queen side but gives white access to the square c4, Portisch stands his ground, queen d7, moving his queen forward to protect the b5 pawn after the knight leaves his c6. This connects his rooks, indicating healthy position with the queen and minor pieces deployed, a successful castling. So black played queen to d7 and then white played d5. In the rouleau-pace, white must choose between blocking the center or maintaining tension with the pawn on d4. Here, advancing to d5 has its drawbacks as it blocks the white's bishop on b3 and restricts the pawn structure flexibility. Vulnerable to c7, c6, which will attack the d5 pawn. Nonetheless, it offers advantages like seizing space, um, displacing the black knight from c6, and then preventing a sudden attack on the e4 pawn through e takes d4. Huebner's choice appears to prioritize a calm center to focus on his queenside pressure plan without disruptions from potential counterattacks. Black played knight e7. The knight retreats but stays in the center. If instead knight a5, then bishop c2 leaves black facing the annoying threat of b4 attacking the knight, knight c4, knight takes knight, pawn takes knight, queen e2 when he loses a pawn. So after knight e7, white played c4. The pressure on b5 intensifies as planned. Black's options are challenging. If b4 faces the threat of c5 followed by c6, winning a piece, and after c5, if d takes c5, then knight takes e5 leaves black's pawns in disarray. Even trying b takes c4, then with knight takes c4 proves inadequate as white's knight on c4 and the freed bishop on c1 lead to a clear attack strategy down the c file, incorporating a5 to target the bishop on b7 and exploit the weak square c6. So after c4, black played knight g6. Portisch stands his ground, refusing to concede on the queen side. He defends the e5 pawn, keeping b5 to b4 available as a viable option since it prevents white's c4 to c5 break as discussed earlier. So after knight g6, white played bishop c2. A quiet retreat preparing to respond to b4 with knight to b3. c6. A vigilant move by Portisch strengthening the b5 pawn and setting up a countermeasure to knight b3. So if knight b3, then he is prepared to respond with b takes c4, which would disrupt the white pawn structure. So after c6, white played b3, pawn to b3. White feels compelled to solidify his center, even though this means he no longer has the option of knight to b3. Black played b4. Only now black blocks the queenside at precisely the right moment. White maintains his base advantage, but his plan of exerting pressure on the queenside hasn't produced any immediate results. Knight h2. Huebner focuses on improving the efficiency of his knights with g4 being a better square than f3 and d5 potentially even better choice. White aims to exchange d takes c6 to open an attack on the queen side on the d file, d6 pawn, the weak d6 pawn, which is a backward pawn without support. However, this move is double-edged as d5 maintains white's space advantage and its removal may give black's light squared bishop more scope to harass the e4 pawn. The threat of d takes c6 provokes a blunder from Portisch. Black played queen to c7. A waiting move which introduces the possibility of knight d7 and knight c5. When the knight is delighted to be placed on a center where it cannot be driven back by an enemy pawn. So after queen c7, white played knight to g4. White reactivates his knight, preparing to respond to knight takes g4 with h takes g4. This grants white control over the f5 square, which can be fortified by maneuvering the knight via f1, followed by e3, then f5, and an attack along the h file involving g3, king g2, rook h1, etc. could be combined with this strategy. So after knight g4, black played bishop to e7. Portisch wisely avoids the capture on g4. He could have carried out the little strategical operation by knight to d7 and then knight c5. But he decides that overall it is preferable to stop the white knight reaching d5 after the response of d takes c6, bishop takes c6, then knight e3. So after bishop e7, white played knight f1, aiming for knight e3, knight f5, or after d takes c6, the d5 square. Black played c takes d5. Better was to play c5 followed by bishop c8. Reactivating the bishop would leave black solidly placed, though white can continue to probe for weaknesses with knight f e3. So after c takes d5, white played c takes d5, opening up the c file, which can be seized control by the rooks. Knight takes g4, exchanging knights to increase space for the remaining pieces. H takes g4. If queen takes g4, then queen takes c2. It's winning for black. So h takes g4 and then bishop c8, redeploying to another diagonal, threatening bishop takes g4, queen takes g4, and then queen takes c2, gaining a pawn. So white played knight e3, supporting the g4 pawn and the bishop on c2. Bishop g5. Portisch continues with the sensible policy of swapping off pieces, but the drawback is that white can use the exchanging sequence to obtain control of the c file. Knight f5. Good move. His first incursion into enemy territory since third move bishop to b5. Black played bishop takes c1, then white played rook takes c1. Black played queen to d8. Black queen steps out of the line of fire. Bishop d3. Already there is the threat of rook c6 attacking d6 and a6. Knight e7. Black keeps the rook out of c6 and challenges the white knight. So after knight e7, also after bishop d3, since black was planning to play rook c6 attacking d6, when black would be obliged to play bishop takes f5, g takes f5, and then knight e7, rook takes a6, drops a pawn anyway. So after bishop d3, black played knight e7, and now white played queen d2. White clears the way for the doubling of the rooks on the c file with gain of time by attacking the b4 pawn. Rook b8. Black played rook b8, supporting the b4 pawn. Rook c2, preparing to double up. Knight takes f5. Black cannot tolerate the knight on f5 any longer. G takes f5. Now white has a bind that stretches across the whole board. Black played f6. If rook e7 to defend the c7 square, then f6. Good move. Then attacking the rook and the pawn on g7. Now if rook c7, then rook takes rook, queen g5, threatening checkmate on g7, g6, then queen h6, followed by checkmate on g7. And instead of rook c7, if black captures the pawn on f6, then queen h6, rook c7, rook, um, the black queen is supporting the f pawn and the rook is attacking the rook. And then white can play rook e3, rook takes rook, rook g3 check, king h8 and queen g7 checkmate. So after knight takes f5, g takes f5, black played f6. Rook e c1. When you double your rooks, you double their power, said Chernev. Rook e7, defending the 7th rank. Rook c6. It looks as if this intrusion can be made by bishop b7, driving back the rook. But Huebner has prepared that the sacrifice bishop takes a6, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, followed by queen d5 check, king h8, bishop b7, followed by a5, when the passed pawns swamp the defending rooks. So after rook c6, black did not play bishop b7. Black played rook to a7. Therefore, black has no choice but to tolerate the invasion of c6. Queen e2. More attack on a6. a5. Generally, it is considered positive when a player's pawns are on squares of the opposite color to their bishop, as seen in this position. However, the bishop on c8 remains a weak piece with limited potential. Bishop b5. In contrast, the white bishop cannot be dislodged from this commanding post. Bishop b7. Portisch attempts to free himself by seeking simplification, even if it means allowing a white rook to reach the 7th rank. Rook c7. Rook on the 7th rank. Planning rook d7. Queen f8. Rook c7 with 2 rooks on the 7th rank. So after rook c7, black played rook c8. Black cannot allow 2 rooks on the 7th. Queen c4, adding in support. Rook a8. Because if rook takes c7, then queen c7, rook takes c7, and then bishop c6 wins a piece. So after queen c4, rook a8, f3, the beginning of an absolutely brilliant idea. White could force an endgame with a rook on the 7th rank immediately with bishop d7. But Huebner sees that black can do nothing, so why not centralize the king so that it will be better placed for the endgame. So after f3, now black played king f8. The black king also moves a square towards the center. White played king f2. The white king strolls to the center of the board as if to inspect the siege works on the c file. Rook a b8. The black pieces desire to strike a blow against the wandering white king, but they are confined to their dungeon on the 1st rank. Now, white played king e3. Now, every white piece is superior to its opposite number in the opponent's camp. g6. Attacking the f5 pawn. Now, white played bishop to d7 as planned. Rook takes c7. Queen takes c7, queen takes c7, rook takes c7, all forced. And then black played bishop to a6. At last, the bishop has an open diagonal, but it is far too late. Bishop e6. Calmly does it. The black pawns are all at the mercy of the white rook, so Huebner has no need to hurry. Black played rook b7. Black cannot allow his pawns to be massacred with rook takes h7. So black played rook b7. Rook c6, attacking the bishop and the pawn. Bishop f1, attacking the g2 pawn. Now white played rook takes d6. Black played bishop c4. Because if white captures the bishop, now b3, and unbelievably, the white pieces are unable to stop the passed pawn queening. So after bishop c4, obviously, white did not capture. White played rook d8 check and black resigned. Because if now king e7, then rook h8, bishop takes b3, then rook takes h7, it's a skewer. And after rook h8, if bishop a6 protecting the rook, then rook takes h7 wins even more pawns. And instead of king e7, if black moves the king to the other side, king g7, then d6. White's bishop suddenly defends the b3 pawn. through the black bishop. If bishop takes bishop, then f takes bishop, and the passed pawns win easily. So this was the game between Huebner and Portisch. So principles to keep in mind: occupy the center with pawns, develop your pieces rapidly towards the center, castle as early as possible, place your rooks on open files, whenever possible double up your rooks on an open file, whenever possible place your rooks on 7th or 8th rank. Passed pawns must be pushed. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Bye bye.